Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we're looking at something pretty fascinating. We're trying to bridge, well, maybe tear down a fence between two seemingly very different worlds.
That's right. On one side, you have modern management science, all the MBAs, KPIs, very structured, very formalized.
And on the other, the comprehensive wisdom and code of life found in Islam going back centuries.
Exactly. And the sources you shared suggest something really interesting, that these aren't separate worlds at all. In fact, they argue that many core principles of, let's say, good ethical management were already there in early Islamic teachings.
So the goal isn't to force Islam onto management.
No, not at all. It's more about recognizing that Islam as a complete way of life already covers these things. The idea is to use modern science maybe as a lens to better understand the wisdom, the hikmah, that was already present.
Okay, and the sources kick off with a pretty bold claim, right? That modern management actually took principles from early Islam.
That's the assertion, yes. A very strong starting point. And they point to things like Mithaq Medina.
The Constitution of Medina.
Precisely. Presented here as, arguably, the world's first written constitution. It laid out governance, rights, duties for everyone in the state, Muslims and non-Muslims alike. That's organizational structure from 1,400 years ago.
And it didn't just stay in Medina, according to these sources.
No, they argue it had a much wider influence. They highlight specific commandments from the Prophet, peace be upon him, particularly from his last sermon, things about justice, equality, human rights.
And the link is?
The link they draw is that these principles seem to be mirrored, maybe even directly copied, into huge global documents later on, like the UN Charter, for example.
Wow. Okay, that suggests a direct line, not just, similar ideas popping up independently.
That's the claim. A direct historical lineage for ideas we often think of as modern breakthroughs in management or human rights.
That is a massive claim. And it raises questions, obviously.
Right.
Correlation versus causation. Proof of lineage.
Absolutely, and that's why the methodology becomes so critical. If we take the source material seriously on this claim of, let's call it historical derivation, then the question becomes how? How do you properly compare a 1,400-year-old religious text with, say, a modern business theory book without, messing it up?
Right, you need a specific way to approach it.
Exactly, a critical approach. And the sources warn about three major pitfalls to avoid.
Okay, let's dig into this methodology. If I'm trying to apply this, what's the first hurdle?
The very first thing the sources hammer home is, don't rely on just one translation, or maybe any single translation, the Tarjuma.
Why not? I mean, if I read the Qur'an in English, surely I'm getting the main idea.
You're getting an idea. But translations, well, they inevitably carry the translator's own background, their specific school of thought, their akida, or maybe just the biases of their era.
Okay, so a filter.
A filter, exactly. And crucially for this topic, translations are usually done by theologians, not, say, management consultants. So the language often doesn't map well onto modern business or organizational terms. The real basis of faith, the sources insist, is the original Arabic text, the matan, not someone's interpretation from centuries later.
So relying only on translation is like, reading a complex legal document translated by someone who only speaks casual slang. You lose the precision.
That's a good way to put it. And that leads right into the second pitfall, terminology.
The words themselves.
Yes. Islamic terms are often deeply religious, spiritual. Think taqwa, which is like God consciousness, or taqyan al-nafs, spiritual purification. Management language is operational, performance metrics, time management, ROI.
It sounds completely different.
On the surface, absolutely. So the comparison can't be about finding exact word-for-word matches. It has to be about the underlying meaning, the mafhum, the essence.
So look past the label to the actual function or principle being described.
Precisely. When Islam talks about fairness in trade, that's not just a religious ideal, it's also a principle of ethical supply chain management, right?
No, that makes sense. But the third point sounds a bit more abstract, broadening the context of revelation. Shani Nuzul. How does that work practically?
This one is maybe the most crucial for actually applying these ideas today. Traditionally, Shani Nuzul refers to the very specific historical situation when a particular verse of the Qur'an was revealed. What was happening in Mecca or Medina at that exact moment.
Right, the immediate historical context.
Yes. But the sources argue that for these rulings to be useful for modern problems, like, say, navigating digital privacy issues or managing a diverse global team, you have to broaden that context.
Broaden it how?
It needs to encompass, and this is a quote, what situations and events until the day of judgment are covered by its ruling. So you move from a specific historical event to a universal principle.
So a verse revealed about a specific dispute back then could be seen as guidance for conflict resolution in a multinational corporation today.
Exactly. It's about seeing the timeless principle behind the specific historical instance. It stops the wisdom from being locked in the 7th century and makes it potentially a tool for now.
Okay, that framework, avoiding translation traps, focusing on meaning, broadening context. It's challenging, but I can see how it makes this comparison possible. So applying that lens, where do the sources show a real shift in management thinking?
Well, the fundamental shift comes because the ultimate goal changes. It's not just about profit or efficiency anymore, but also about seeking, God's pleasure and reward in the hereafter.
And how does that play out in specific management areas?
Let's take social networking first. In the West, networking is often, let's be honest, about what I can get out of it. Building connections to help my career, my goals, it can be quite transactional.
Yeah, very much about self-benefit.
Right. Now, the Islamic perspective doesn't dismiss the usefulness of networks, but it adds this really important layer. You should also use your network to actively look for ways to help others. Khidmat Khalaq, service to creation.
Service to creation. So it's not just take, it's also give.
It's a balance of rights and responsibilities within the network. It becomes less about extraction and more about mutual support and contribution.
How would you even measure that in a company? Do you give people points for helping colleagues?
Maybe not points, but you could foster a culture that values it.
Yeah.
Perhaps tracking mentorship, cross-departmental support that isn't strictly required, community outreach facilitated by the company. It's about building that ethic into the organization's DNA. It changes the whole feel of networking.
It definitely shifts the focus. Okay. What's another area where the perspective changes things significantly?
Right, success itself. And the values that underpin it. Think about Western social values. They evolve, right? What's considered acceptable or ethical can change quite rapidly based on social trends or approval.
Sure. Things are constantly being reevaluated.
But Islamic values, being rooted in the Qur'an and Sunnah, are presented as fixed, constant. So the benchmark for success, ethical success, doesn't shift with public opinion.
That must provide a certain stability.
Immense stability, especially for long-term thinking. But the biggest difference is linking worldly success, good business results, organizational health directly to the akhirah, the hereafter, and to seeking God's pleasure, the raza.
So hitting your quarterly targets is good, but how you hit them matters for your spiritual bottom line. Did you earn salab, that heavenly reward?
Precisely. Imagine a manager facing a choice. Cut costs using a supplier with questionable labor practices. A purely secular view might weigh the financial gain against the reputational or legal risk.
Standard risk management.
But if the manager is also thinking about earning raza and sawab, the calculation changes entirely. Is the short-term profit worth the potential spiritual loss or, worse, punishment? It introduces this powerful, intrinsic, ethical check.
That's a fundamentally different driver for behavior. Now, the third area you mentioned was this chain of action, developing personality, shakhsiyat. The sources laid out a kind of pathway for this.
Yes, it's a fascinating model, almost like reverse engineering good character or performance. It starts with the end result. Personality, shakhsiyat.
Okay, how someone presents their character.
Which, they say, is based on your deeds, your amal, your actions, what you actually do. Pretty standard management idea so far, right? Performance is based on actions.
Right, your track record.
But then it goes deeper. Your deeds, amal, are based on your intention, your niyat. Why are you doing what you're doing? What's the underlying purpose? This is where the spiritual dimension really clicks in.
So the why behind the what, the intention validates the action.
Exactly, and it doesn't stop there. Intention, niyat itself, comes from your conclusion or decision, what the sources call fiqh. You have to decide to have a certain intention.
Okay, so intention isn't just a feeling, it's a result of a decision.
A conscious decision, yes. And that decision, fiqh, is based on your thought process, your sok. This is the analysis, the thinking it through, the asking questions.
We're really getting back to the cognitive roots now.
All the way back. Because finally, your thought process, so sok, is based on your Knowledge, your ilm. What do you actually know? What information have you processed and understood?
So the ultimate inputs are knowledge and thought process.
That's the key takeaway for management, according to these sources. We often focus on the outputs, the personality, the deeds, but the real leverage points, the things you need to develop and manage carefully, are the quality of knowledge, ilm, and the rigor of the thought process, sah, that leads to the decision, which shapes the intention, niyat, which drives the deeds, amal.
Wow. It's like a complete system from foundational knowledge to outward behavior. It really highlights managing the inputs, not just measuring the outputs.
Very much so. And the whole point of drawing these parallels, this comparison, isn't about saying Islam is better than an MBA or vice versa. It's about providing clarity, especially for professionals who live and work across both secular and religious frameworks.
To avoid confusion, basically. And there was that example in the sources about the UN paper.
Yes. The experts shared a personal story. They had a paper accepted by a UN platform. Why? Because it promoted human rights using Qur'anic and Sunnah references, but crucially, it did so without attacking the secular human rights framework.
So it showed common ground, not conflict.
Exactly. It demonstrated how the Islamic perspective could add to the conversation about human betterment, enriching it, rather than trying to replace it. It's about finding shared goals.
That speaks volumes of the approach. It also connects to how we evaluate performance, doesn't it? Modern management, especially in ethical fields, looks beyond just the final numbers.
It absolutely does. It's increasingly about how you got the results. Was the behavior ethical? Were the methods sound?
And that mirrors the Islamic view.
A very strong parallel. The sources emphasize that on the day of judgment, our deeds, amal, aren't just judged by the outcome, but by the method. Was the action halal permissible, ethical, or was it haram forbidden, unethical? You can't achieve a good result through fundamentally bad means and expect it to count positively. The process validates the result, both professionally and spiritually.
Okay, and one final important warning from the sources, something about internal issues.
Yes, a strong caution against getting bogged down in sectarian differences, the maslak. The sources are quite blunt about this, calling it a local corruption. Meaning that focusing too much on minor interpretive differences between various schools of thought can obscure the big universal principles found in the Qur'an and Sunnah. It prevents a unified, coherent engagement with modern fields like management science. It keeps the application fragmented.
So keep the focus on the foundational teachings.
That's the plea. Focus on the core principles that unite, rather than the details that might divide, especially when trying to apply this wisdom broadly.
Okay, so wrapping this up, our deep dive suggests that engaging with modern management science isn't somehow opposed to Islamic principles. Instead, it can actually be a tool.
A tool to better understand and appreciate the depth, the logic, the operational effectiveness that's already embedded within Islamic teachings, provided, of course, you use that critical, unbiased methodology we discussed.
And the final takeaway, the essence of it all.
It's quite profound, really. The essence of what you might call Islamic management is about intention. It's taking any ordinary work task, meeting a deadline, managing a team, planning a budget, and elevating it.
Elevating it how?
By consciously changing your intention, your niyat. You do the task not just because it's your job, but also with the specific intention of seeking God's pleasure, Raza. That simple shift transforms a mundane professional duty into an act of worship, ibadah.
So your entire professional life becomes part of your spiritual practice.
Potentially, yes. And that leads us to a final thought for you, the listener, to maybe reflect on.
Go ahead.
If the ultimate goal for a Muslim professional isn't just maximizing profit or career advancement, but also earning that spiritual reward, sawab, by connecting their work to the akhirah, the hereafter, well, how does that change the practical calculations? How might that focus on spiritual return affect day-to-day decisions about risk, about ethics, about long-term strategy for both the individual and the organization? Something to think about.